Good evening and welcome to tonight's weekly news, where we bring you the latest in the ongoing worldwide conflict. News from the League of Nations, as before the Battle of the Skagerrak Strait was even complete, the officer who ultimately won it, the one who was coming to be known across the world in a kind of journalistic shorthand as the Captain, took to the radio and wrote to every major newspaper that could be reached, exhorting humanity to come stand united behind the League of Nations at the start of the Zurich Conference. Their argument was that only a coordinated international response could protect human life, and the League of Nations was the only organization that existed that could provide a supranational umbrella under which such a force could organize. There was no time to waste. There were no national interests that mattered more right now than defeating the Morganas. The public took notice. Support for the League rocketed upward along with reports of a joint Kriegsmarine Royal Navy operation to save Oslo and northern Denmark at the climax of the battle. It seemed a time of incredible possibilities. Of course, for the actual members of the League of Nations, and for the diplomats and bureaucrats who ran the day-to-day operations, it was also a time of total chaos. Nothing in their careers had prepared them for this. The League charter certainly didn't anticipate it, and only months before the entire organization had seemed like a spent force. "Hooray for the Captain," an anonymous League staffer reportedly said, "but damned if I'd know how we're going to do it." On October 31st, the Zurich Conference formally opened at the Palace of Nations. News from the Axis. At the end of the week, Hitler addressed the Reichstag with a message to Mussolini, and one that he didn't particularly want to hear. The destiny of Southeast Europe will be settled by Germany and the Soviet Union. Mussolini's Greater Balkan Neutrality Pact would not be a welcome development in either Moscow or Berlin. News from the Comintern, where a French chateau was under scrutiny as a place of high interest to the French government, and thus the Comintern. An attempt was made to cultivate a seemingly sympathetic staff in order to arrange for continued access. They failed. Two of the people of interest were not responsive. One indicated they would go to the authorities if approached again, and their best bet ended up tripping over a bicycle as he tried to run away from the guards after he immediately raised suspicion. News from Italy, as foreign diplomats looked at Italy's choices this week and found them consistent with three fairly solid hypotheses. Mussolini wanted the Dalmatian coast, he wanted a friendly buffer between Italy and Germany, and he was resentful of Germany's own efforts in the Balkans. Regia Marina ships, badly worn from months of relentless fighting, were sent to prowl in the Adriatic Sea, scouring out the ships and defenses of the Royal Yugoslav Navy, and of course any Morganas that might complicate proceedings. It was expected that Prince Paul would recognize the threat for what it was. Of course, at the same time, Italy was preparing to offer him and his neighbors a diplomatic overture. The Italian government had resolved upon the creation of a Greater Balkan Neutrality Pact. Ideally, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey, Greece, and Hungary would all come together in a strong alliance, strong enough to deter the Nazis from looking south of Germany and the captured Polish territories, and the Soviets beyond the borders of Romania. Meanwhile, as the Morgana mist receded from the Italian shores, people stopped talking wistfully about the glories of the Vanity Palace. The strange mood that had gripped them passed almost as quickly as it came. News from the United Kingdom, as arguably the biggest development for the UK this week was the triumphant Battle of the Iceland Sea, an outcome as surprising to the 12th Cruiser Squadron as it was to the Morganas. British scouts discovered a significant group of cargo ships adrift and unoccupied. The Admiralty quickly resolved that they wouldn't try to salvage the cargoes for themselves. God only knew what had been done to them. It presented a unique opportunity, however. On the 30th, the AMC Dunatar Castle was sent out, seemingly alone, but shadowed closely by the 6 destroyers and by the 12th cruisers a bit farther away. What should have been an irresistible bait turned out to be a trap set by the Morganas themselves. When the shooting was done, it was as clean a victory as anyone could have wanted. Within days, Churchill was receiving telegrams of gratitude from FDR. A lull in the fighting along the northeastern seaboard might genuinely have been the result of the battle off Iceland's northern coast. The Royal Navy had one other action of some significance. It concluded an investigation of its own into the sinking of Royal Oak, temporarily barring the scientists and research of the Pembroke 7 from accessing the wreck. Amid conclusive evidence of German involvement, vital remnants, vestures of Royal Oak were recovered as a result. Pembroke 7 spearheaded the investigation of possible artillery fire from Hoy, but soon came to the conclusion that no gunfire from those islands. Reports of fire from that direction were put down to the after-images of muzzle flashes in the eyes of the lookouts. That corner of British intelligence dedicated to understanding the Morgana threat was not happy about being excluded from Royal Oak in the critical days after her sinking, but they soon patched things over. They subsequently purchased a set of wrecks from Ernest Cox and set up a research station on top of one of them. Finally, the strange mood of discontent that had gripped the British Isles seemed to recede this week. The sour thoughts and bitter words of the previous week were soon forgotten by friends. News from the United States. It was arguably the hardest week of fighting the U.S. had yet endured in the Morgana War in both the Atlantic and Pacific. Early in the morning on the 28th, American forces in the Caribbean steamed into the storms that battered western Puerto Rico, eager to challenge the Morgana fleet known to be gathering there. The American screen immediately proved their value by uncovering a submarine ambush. A wave of at least 6 Venoms sank the Biddle, and badly damaged the engines of a newly recommissioned Blakely, but no major ships were damaged or threatened. As destroyers began hunting Venom, the Morgana fleet, waiting under the cover of rain, saw their chance and steamed out to engage an American fleet. A chaotic battle developed, and with Venoms periodically returning to launch more torpedo attacks amid the surface battle. At first, only the generally poor Morgana gunnery saved the fleet, but the heavier guns and armor of the Atlantic battleships soon proved decisive. Herbert was lost in the battle as she valiantly challenged an enemy cruiser. The fleet chased the routing Morganas into the storm system, and discovered the source of the weather disturbances. A strange device, anchored seemingly in the depths of the Puerto Rican Trench. It was cut free and taken aboard Moffett. The Morgana device was ultimately transported to an impoverished, secure facility at Havana Harbor, but 109 American sailors lost their lives in its capture. The storms near Puerto Rico dissipated by the 30th. Meanwhile, the bulk of the Pacific Fleet sailed at speed for the relief of Manila. The battle was preceded by a combined airstrike from the Army and Navy on the gathered Morganas, before the battlefleet arrived to challenge them. The Americans, steaming out of the Verde Island Passage, tried at first to force the Morganas between Corregidor and their line, but the enemy started steaming west almost immediately as they caught sight of the Americans. The outcome was a swift and decisive American victory. General MacArthur, newly reactivated, received the fleet at Manila. News from Japan, as the first formal meeting between the Emperor and the risen kami, was a most auspicious occasion. There was an absence, and a conspicuous one. Nagato had not been able to attend, but even here, there was cause for contentment. She had left for Formosa with a large escort, to lead the kami there against the Morganas that gathered like a storm, east of Taihoku. That could not change the fact that it was a day that changed all of Japan, and a day that made the prospect of surprise Chinese offensive seem distant and unimportant. And yet, at the same time, the Morgana fire drifted in her myriad into Japanese waters. Be sure to tune in tomorrow for an extended special report on the ceremony between the kami and the Japanese emperor. News from France, as the Daladier and George Mandel gathered their exports and weighed their options in Indochina, and none of them seemed particularly promising. The minister of the colonies and his faction argued that Hanoi had no hope of self-sufficiency, with Morganas feasting upon commerce in the Gulf of Siam and South China Sea, and they argued passionately that France could not afford to divert military supplies from the metropole, as Germany was embarking on a campaign of conquest. Indeed, they had some sympathy with those who called for the return of Georges Cottereau, whose talents were wasted in an unwinnable theater. Daladier's government decided then that turning to the British was the best possible option. They would be offered bases in Indochina and a commercial treaty for Indochinese resources. In exchange, the Royal Navy would be asked to provide a degree of naval security that the Marine Nationale could not guarantee alone. On the eve of these negotiations, a certain calm settled in Paris. Interdepartmental turmoil, at least over this particular question, cooled and settled. The decision was made, and all that remained was to be seen what their friends across the Channel would ask in return. News from Germany, where this week the Kriegsmarine faced 2 political tests, neither of which one was resolved to the satisfaction of their masters in Berlin. The first and more public crisis came in the form of the Admiral Scheer and her acting captain, Erich Furneck. Scheer had been badly damaged weeks before, and her belle had somehow relocated her to the other side of the Atlantic in an instant. As they gathered themselves at the edge of American waters, they found an American vessel, the SS Pancraft, under attack from a Morgana fleet, and apparently transporting war supplies intended for British use. The Scheer sunk the Pancraft, rescued her crew to supplement Scheer's own, and made their way back to the North Sea, where the British promptly accused them of piracy. Furneck surrendered himself not to the British, but instead to the League of Nations, where an independent investigation of his behavior would be conducted. In the Baltic Sea, certain Kriegsmarine vessels had come upon the badly damaged Polish submarine Orzel. She had left Polish waters for safe harbor in Estonia in the early days of the war. and there the crew had been declared interned, and the Estonians had attempted to secure the submarine for the duration. Ultimately, the officer in question chose to abide by the informal consensus taken in the early days of the Morgana War. That is, a Woken Belle was to be considered under the flag of the League of Nations, and that all due courtesy was to be given. So the Kriegsmarine sailors helped patch the damage to her hull as best they could, and made her swear not to attack any German vessels on her way out to the North Sea, and then they let her go. Tighter controls on the Kriegsmarine were in the offing at the OKW. Finally, news from the Soviet Union, as the Soviets made two important decisions this week. The first involved the survivors of Disease's Romanian campaign. The last surviving inhabitants of a small settlement between the Komarova Forest and the Black Sea in southeastern Romania were bundled up, coughing and shivering, into a convoy of unmarked, heavily guarded trucks and taken north. Soviet and Romanian troops ferreted out the last of Disease's creations and destroyed them. The Dara Trias was also driven north. The second decision was a response to a communique from Prince Paul of Yugoslavia. He hoped that forging a stronger friendship between his nation and the Soviet Union might give the Italians pause. Stalin's government declined, recalling the long association with White Russians in Yugoslavia. They made Mussolini aware that they had declined as well. Meanwhile, in the Baltic, the Morgana Starvation appeared outside the Kronstadt forts guarding the approach to Leningrad. This one seemed different than the others, almost so translucent as to be invisible. She drew fire, of course, but she seemed unconcerned, or rather, she seemed too angry to care. She accused the Soviets of making a deal with the Morgana avarice, and she promised that the citizens of Leningrad would suffer if they didn't find a way to make it up for her. That's all for this week. Join us again next week as we bring you the latest news from around the world. From all of us at the studio, good night and stay safe out there.